Thank you to everyone who is joining us. We have a few announcements as everyone joins our session. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen in Whova. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It looks like we're ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to Susan to get us all ready to go.
Hi, welcome everyone. You are in the Restoration and Ecosystem Resilience session, and I will be the moderator today. We're going to give the speakers a 5-minute warning for the 15-minute mark, but they actually have through 20 minutes if they want to use that. Hopefully leave time for questions. Feel free to ask questions either during the presentation or afterwards. You can turn off your mute button and ask the questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kevin Robertson. He's the program director for the Fire Ecology program at Tall Timbers Research Station and is going to be speaking today on disturbance. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay. Thanks very much for that introduction. And title of my talk is "What is disturbance and why does it matter?" It's not a data presentation today. It's more of a conceptual presentation, trying to encourage us to think about disturbance in a way that's going to help us communicate it better through papers and presentations and conferences such as this. So the term disturbance is ubiquitous in the fields of ecology and natural resource management. However, we don't always stop to think about what is a disturbance exactly. A lot of times we have kind of a, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck sort of concept of disturbance. And just kind of know it when we see it. But the failure to define disturbances when we talk about them can cause some problems. Even though it's common in literature to have titles such as these, where the word disturbance is used, it's often not defined in a way that lets us know what it really means in a particular context. And sometimes, a paper about fire I'll get all the way through the abstract without even seeing the word fire in it. Instead, they're just references to disturbances, as if that has a lot of meaning by itself without any further qualification. So just to kind of get an idea of some of the problems that can arise from this, even if we focus on one ecosystem, the longleaf pine wiregrass ecosystem, which I do a lot of work at here at Tall Timbers in the Southeast, we can see that there are a lot of different ways we can think about disturbance. I threw 6 up here, but I could easily probably think of 50 more if we really stop to think about it. If we think of disturbance as broadly as a discrete event that has some impact on the ecosystem. Prescribed fire is one. A disc fire break might influence the herbaceous vegetation in a very extreme way without influencing the trees. A hurricane and logging can influence the trees without influencing the understory vegetation, et cetera, et cetera. Very broadly speaking, the way that disturbance has been used historically is in one of 2 ways. The first, in more kind of traditional sense, was an event that resets succession by creating a blank slate or an open space, as kind of shown in this classic disturbance or succession picture here from Encyclopedia Britannica, where you have a disturbance event such as fire that's considered to eliminate all the vegetation, which is followed by pioneer species and then intermediate species and culminates in the climax community that's relatively stable. The more modern and kind of broader and more general and oftentimes more useful definition of disturbance is an event usually always considered a relatively discrete event that damages organisms and causes changes to the ecosystem in some way or another. So focusing on this disturbance concept, number 1 of the blank slate, it requires a completely unvegetated state to begin with. However, such conditions are pretty often, or most of the time, caused by geomorphic events rather than ecological disturbances. So it's kind of hard to imagine what kind of disturbance would convert a beech and maple broadleaf forest into exposed rocks, other than like a nuclear bomb or something. But primary succession does occur in situations where substrates are being formed, like a point bar being deposited on a meandering river, where succession occurs, or deposition of lava in volcanic environments where the community has to start from scratch. So even though these blank slates are relatively uncommon, they do occur in nature, and it's good to know when and to make that distinction. However, this initial sense of disturbance started to kind of fall away from favor in ecology, mostly because it was found that it's pretty rare. So even very extreme events like Hurricane Andrew in Long Pine Key in the Everglades, which was a Category 5 hurricane, it mostly just kind of breaks up vegetation and causes it to resprout and doesn't really eliminate it or cause a blank slate. Or similarly, oftentimes frequent fires and fire-dependent ecosystems top kill vegetation, after which it readily resprouts. So again, not really creating a blank slate, although it opens it up maybe to seed regeneration and such. Floods oftentimes just result in plants being covered with silt and they keep growing. And even the most extreme disturbances, such as a volcanic eruption or a 100-year fuel accumulation wildfire, tend to be somewhat patchy in their effects, and they're often islands of vegetation that survive and come through under those most extreme cases. However, they do occur. They just tend to occur in nature on much smaller scales. Disturbance was originally conceptualized as eliminating an entire ecosystem over a large area, but primary succession or true blank slate succession tends to occur more, again, looking at the longleaf pine ecosystem that I'm most familiar with, on soil deposition by burrowing animals, or a tree tip up that's exposing fresh mineral soil sterilization from burning of coarse woody debris, and including deposition of new dead plants like a fallen tree that's a new substrate for microbial succession. The same could be said for dead animals or carcasses that I didn't show in case somebody was eating their lunch right now. And because of the limitations of this of the traditional succession model, there have been papers like this one by Alan Diaz and Bartolome in 1998, suggesting that we transition from a successional model, as in the case of sagebrush grass vegetation, to a state transition model, which provides the flexibility of not requiring a disturbance to change from one condition to another, but really just focuses on prevailing conditions that might cause ecosystems to change from one state to another. We turn to this broader and more flexible disturbance concept too, of just disturbances that damage organisms and can have a wide range of effects, including maintenance of populations and communities. That gives us some more flexibility. So under this definition, disturbances can be considered to be maintaining and not just resetting succession or a particular state. I often describe the longleaf pine savannas as being almost like a lawn where the fire acts as a lawnmower, where you mow the grass and everything just comes back up again, and you're keeping it in a particular state, instead of the so-called disturbance or the fire transitioning it to a different state. But with a broader and more flexible definition, it kind of opens up a lot of questions as well. So, well, what exactly does constitute a disturbance? When should we call it a disturbance? How severe does it need to be called a disturbance? How much of the ecosystem does it have to affect to be considered a disturbance? Is disturbance limited to natural disturbances that happen historically, or can it be anthropogenic? And of course, as soon as I say that, a lot of people will say, well, anthropogenic is natural because people have been on the landscape for a long time. So in that case, does disturbance include using a bulldozer or strip mining? Does it have to refer to things that have happened in history, or can they be novel disturbances that haven't occurred in the past, et cetera? So, we have kind of a mess here in defining disturbance. But I suggest that rather than trying to come up with a comprehensive definition of disturbance, it's simply important to define disturbance, to say what we mean when we use the term. And this usually manifests itself when writing or giving a presentation or communicating about science in pretty much any format. It's important to say what we mean exactly when we talk about disturbance. And the suggestion that I have is to make sure that our discussions of disturbance include these three elements that compose disturbance, one being the agent of disturbance, that which causes it, an object of disturbance, and the effect of disturbance. Now, these three elements of disturbance don't necessarily have to be conceptualized in this order. It might be easier to think of it as the agent affecting the object, or you start with an object and then an agent comes along and results in an effect. But the bottom line is, if we include these three factors of disturbance in our discussion, then it'll increase a lot of clarity about what we mean when we use the word disturbance. So just to provide some examples to illustrate, in the case of Hurricane Andrew hitting the Everglades, the hurricane is the agent, the tropical hardwood hammock is the object, and the effect is specifically damage to trees. And it may not have had a big effect on other things other than the indirect effects or the secondary effects of increased light, et cetera. But most of the trees were just resprouted from epicormic sprouts and were reset again. I was studying mostly the epiphytes, which are also influenced by the hurricane when I was down there. Another example, again, returning to longleaf pine savannas, is if we take a surface fire of low intensity, and the object of interest that we're focused on in a particular study is resprouting woody plants, then the effect would be top kill specifically. It would be important to specify that. Now, top kill is not killing the genetic individual, and most of these woody plants resprout readily and end up being pretty similar to they were at the end of the fire turn interval as they were before the fire. If we zoom in a little bit and look at the same surface fire, and we're discussing the object of microbes on dead leaves, then the result could be catastrophic destruction of that entire ecosystem, which basically resets succession until there's new material deposited that starts microbial succession over again in a new season. If once again we kind of zoom out and think of the same surface fire as impacting longleaf pine trees, then it's possible that the effect is virtually nothing if the fire didn't raise the temperature of the vascular cambium by 1 degree, if it had 0 needle scorch, which is often the case with a very low intensity fire in this ecosystem. So we can see that it matters what the object is and what the effect is in considering what exactly this disturbance is. So this kind of opens up the question in some ecosystems, which has often been the case in the longleaf pine ecosystem, of, well, is fire a disturbance or not? And I would argue that the important question is not, is fire a disturbance, but does fire cause a disturbance? And it may be a little awkward to phrase it this way, maybe in a paper, but I think it's helpful to think of it this way. And before we start to write or talk about disturbance, to really zoom in on what we mean when we're thinking about fire and what its effects are. So, for example, putting it in some context, we would never really talk about, the question of, is wind a disturbance? We would say, well, it depends. If it's a very strong wind, then it would certainly cause a disturbance by breaking trees, et cetera, in the case of a hurricane. But if it's just a breeze through the savanna, then we wouldn't consider it a disturbance. We would never say precipitation is a disturbance. We would say, well, it depends. A 100-year flood could certainly cause a disturbance, whereas a drizzle in the forest would not. I think it's helpful to think about fire in the same sort of way. And just kind of looping back around to my original point about the importance of not thinking of fire disturbance as exactly the same thing. Fire is a subset of disturbance. I think it's relevant to talk about fire as being a disturbance in that order, but disturbance and fire are not exactly the same thing. And sometimes when people are most definitively talking about fire, they decide to just put in the word disturbance instead, as if it makes you sound smarter or something, or sounds more theoretical, but it really just kind of muddies the water a little bit if it's fire that you really mean. Oftentimes you'll see titles of papers or dissertations that say things like effects of repeated disturbance on critical ecosystem processes, which means pretty much nothing without any further definition. And like I said, you can sometimes get all the way through an abstract without even knowing what's meant by disturbance. So just to summarize, disturbance is an important concept in ecology with real management implications. I've actually literally had people come to me and say, we disked up a longleaf pine savanna, so that's good, right? Because it's a disturbance-dependent ecosystem. We created a disturbance, a reset succession. And I'm thinking, yeah, you just destroyed a natural community that's probably never going to come back. So it does have real management implications to be clear about what we mean by disturbance, especially if we're saying it's a disturbance dependent community, because that can mean a lot of things. Professional literature and communication is often vague in its use of the term disturbance, as if it has meaning without any further clarification. That really, given all the different things that disturbance could mean, it really means almost nothing by itself. Disturbance has broadly been conceptualized as either an event that creates a blank slate in reset succession, or else an event that simply damages organisms. And I think it's important to get this straight too in talking about it, because there is a time to talk about disturbance in the first sense, if we really mean primary succession. We just wrote a paper about succession on old fields where it was pretty much a blank slate where we started. And in that case, the disturbance was the disking that had this kind of effect. Fire is not a disturbance by default, but it can cause disturbances. Again, it's helpful to think of it that way. And if you mean fire, just say fire. It's okay, or whatever disturbance is being addressed. My main take-home message is I wanted to encourage people to think about fire and think about disturbances always containing an agent, an object, and an effect. And I think if we can specify those three things, then we're always going to be pretty effective in communicating what we mean by disturbance. And finally, following these guidelines should improve scientific communication and effectiveness of natural resource management. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I actually hadn't put it together that I was thinking about wind as kind of a disturbance agent, but that it was really wind throw that the disturbance, that's how I refer to it. And then I think you caught me. I will actually really rethink this as I approach my language around fire. So thank you. I don't see any questions, but I have some. And so I would definitely encourage people to write questions or even turn off your mute button. And we do have some time for questions for Kevin, but in the absence of them, I have a question for you. So I was wondering if you might be able to describe a little bit more about longleaf pine ecosystems. I know that I had the privilege of being in the field with you at one point where you were talking about especially the understory shrub assemblage as being an old growth community. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty fascinating to hear about gopher mounds as a potential type of disturbance, really maintained obligate cedars versus those bulldozer lines that you were referring to in your talk. So if you could.
Yeah. I mean, you know, in a broad sense, it's maybe helpful to think of it as an old growth community, and that most of it's stable. Most of the species have a lot of characteristics of old growth, you know, life history characteristics in terms of their being long lived, they're persistent, they resprout after fire. They tend to not be very good at getting into newly disturbed blank slates, you know, so to speak. And so they're pretty stable over time or maintained by frequent fire, but it's really more complicated than that. I mean, there's a big kind of caveat in saying that they're old growth communities, because like I said, I think succession is occurring in these communities. It's just kind of at these smaller scales where these patches are opening up. And of course, longleaf pine is a bit of a head scratcher. You know, it might line up with like Connell and Slatyer's tolerance model, in that it's a very long-lived species. It could live to be 500 years old, and yet it requires a disturbance for a seedling to become established in the newly exposed mineral soil. So it's right there at the beginning of things, right after a fire. So, but you know, again, you could consider fire to be sort of maintaining that longleaf pine life cycle. Whereas if you do have a disturbance like a tree tip up or a sterilized area from burning of heavy coarse woody debris, you do get early successional species in those patches. You know, they're kind of weedy species that were either in the soil bank just waiting for a disturbance, or that blow in from somewhere else. It's been almost unstudied, actually. I'd like to study it, but really haven't gotten around to studying like true kind of conventional succession within the longleaf pine ecosystem.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, in the 30 seconds we have, there's some parallels with Douglas fir ecology too, just a species that really needs disturbance to get started. And then throughout its life stage, wind disturbances have a role too. It's kind of fascinating. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I think we're going to move to the next speaker in 1 minute. Okay. Great. I see Hannah is loading her presentation right now, and we will start at 10:20. Excellent. So our next speaker is Hannah Weinberger. Hannah is a biologist with Ascent Environmental in Chico, California. She recently completed her master's degree at California State University, Chico, and has studied post-fire plant recovery in bulldozer lines. Thank you, Hannah. Let's get started.
Sorry about that. All right, can you see my screen? Sorry about that.
Now we
That's great.
can. Great.
Great. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah Weinberger, and today I'm going to be sharing part of my master's thesis work I did in Dr. Kristen Kaczynski's Applied Plant Ecology Lab. And I'm also going to be sharing some work Claire Monahan did as an undergraduate researcher in Kristen's lab at California State University, Chico. And today we're going to be talking about slowed obligate cedar recovery post-fire in dozer lines. So dozer line or fire lines are a type of fire suppression technique, and fire suppression programs here in the United States have seen increased costs over the past several decades. When putting in a fire line, the goals usually consist of changing fire behavior as well as allowing for safe firefighter access. This piece of changing fire behavior has seen less success over the past several years as we have an increase in wind-driven fire events, especially here in California. Issues that can arise when installing fire lines include erosion issues, as well as an increased fire risk due to non-native invasion. The dozer line I'm going to be discussing today did see increases in non-native cover while I was sampling between 2 growing seasons. I won't be going over that data today, but it is something to keep in mind that I did see significant increases in non-native cover in the dozer line discussed today. So this is the 32 fire site where we conducted most of our work. This fire is located northeast of Chico, California, and Chico is about 3 hours northeast of the Bay Area here in California. This fire occurred in September of 2017 and was about 11 hectares in area, so a very modest fire. And this was on a moderate slope. This is Highway 32, and this is at about 550 meters above sea level, and it goes down to about 460 meters. This is a map of the fire line. This fire line is a 1/2 kilometer in length and 6 to 12.2 meters in width, with the widest areas being kind of in the northwest portion of the burn. This fire line was put in by a bulldozer, so I'm going to be referring to it as the dozer line for the remainder of this talk. Vegetation communities sampled included manzanita in turquoise, California black oak in blue, and wedgeleaf ceanothus in this hot pink. And a reminder that the dozer line was the widest kind of in this wedgeleaf ceanothus community. Unburned plots were sampled. They're not shown on this map, but they were sampled in the same canyon as the burn. Disturbance levels sampled included burned, dozer line, and unburned reference sites. To switch gears just a little bit before we dive into some of the data, I wanted to go over the 2 main strategies for post-fire regeneration in a Mediterranean climate. The first one is that of the obligate cedars. These species post-fire adult individuals will usually die, and they rely heavily on recruitment from the seed bank. Obligate cedar seeds require fire for germination, And these species usually do not resprout after fire. Examples of obligate cedars on site include this whiteleaf manzanita, which was found in some of our burn plots, as well as wedgeleaf ceanothus. Resprouting is the other main strategy. So resprouters post-fire, adult individuals will usually survive the fire, and they'll usually be resprouting from the root burl. Resprouters can regenerate from seed. So there's a group of resprouters that only can resprout, and there's a group of resprouters that can resprout and regenerate from seed, but we're just going to be including them in the same category for the purposes of this talk. These species can actually resprout in response to mechanical treatment. So this includes a bulldozer clearing an area for a fire or dozer line. And examples of resprouters on site include scrub oak and chaparral honeysuckle. For my master's thesis, I sampled in the spring of 2018 and 2019, and this was 6 and 18 months post-fire. For my master's thesis, I sampled for percent cover in vegetation and environmental variables in these 3 square meter plots pictured in blue. And then in this outer larger plot, I sampled for presence absence species data as well as cover class environmental variable data. Looking at some of my master's thesis data, this is a graph of average shrub and tree cover in 2018. We have vegetation community on the y-axis, and then we have percent cover on the x-axis. For all of the graphs I'm going to be showing you today, we have burn, dozer line, and unburned reference sites, and they'll always be in this order. So for example, if we're looking at this data right here, we have California black oak in the burn community. So that's the plot data for California black oak burn. And these solid lines are the mean of that data. So looking at this data more closely for shrub and tree cover in 2018, in these chaparral communities, so wedgeleaf and manzanita, we can see that in the burn and in the dozer line, there was slow recovery 6 months post-fire. When we call our attention to the dozer line, we can see that shrub and tree cover was actually 0% for 2018 in our plots sampled. When we move on to 2019, so 18 months post-fire, we can see that these chaparral communities did see a fair amount of recovery in the burned area, which is great. But in the dozer line, when we call our attention to this data, we can see that in wedgeleaf ceanothus dozer line, shrub and tree cover remained at 0% in our plot sampled. Breaking that data into more of a species level, these graphs are the same except we have species now on the y-axis, and we can see that resprouters are in green. These are the 5 species that had the most increases of percent cover between 6 and 18 months post-fire. And we can see they are all resprouters that had the most percent cover increases. We can see there is some growth in the dozer line. And when we look at 2019 at the dozer line, we can see that scrub oak and poison oak were the most successful woody species in the dozer line, and they are both resprouters. Scrub oak was one of those species that I visually saw adult individuals on the dozer line that had been chopped by the dozer, but were resprouting. So that's an example of a species that does resprout in response to mechanical treatments. Diving into Claire Monahan's project, she was interested in looking at woody seedling growth on this same burn and dozer line. So she sampled the exact same plots I sampled for my master's thesis, and she sampled 18 months post-fire, so the second year I was gathering data, and she was counting woody seedlings in this larger plot. So first, looking at the California black oak community data for woody seedlings 18 months post-fire For these graphs, we have species on the y-axis and number of seedlings on the x-axis. And then we have the disturbance levels in the middle again. We can see that deer brush right here in the left-hand corner had a large amount of woody seedlings in some of our plots, up to an outlier of over 200 seedlings in one of our plots, but the average was just below 50. Because there were so many woody seedlings in deer brush, it's a bit hard to see what is going on in the dozer line, although we can see some growth. So let's remove deer brush from the graph. So this is the same data. It just has different scale bars because deer brush is removed. So we can see, calling our attention to the dozer line, that we have chaparral honeysuckle woody seedlings, as well as buckeye and bay laurel seedlings. But we do not see any obligate cedars, just resprouters. Moving on to the manzanita community, we can see obligate cedars represented in orange. Whiteleaf manzanita and common manzanita were both found in the burn area, along with some resprouters. But when we call our attention to those dozer line plots, we can see that obligate cedars are missing from the dozer line plots. Kind of the same story in the wedgeleaf community. We can see obligate cedars and resprouters in the burn area. But in the dozer line, we actually see no woody seedlings at all, including missing obligate cedars. So in conclusion, we saw no obligate cedars in any of the dozer line plots 6 or 18 months post-fire. And these species will most likely not come back in these dozer line areas due to lack of fire and their requirement for fire for seed germination. Obligate cedars provide many ecosystem services, including food and habitat for multiple wildlife species. This includes anything from the smallest gall-making aphids we see here on this whiteleaf manzanita, all the way up to our large brown or black bears that we have as neighbors here in California. So thinking about the lessons learned from Claire and my studies, although our fire our study area was only 11 hectares for the burn, and our dozer line was only a half a kilometer in length, we can use the lessons learned and apply it to larger fires and think about what that might mean in the greater landscape. So first we can look at the Thomas Fire, which was 114,000 hectares, and this occurred in Southern California, igniting in December of 2017. And this resulted in the installation of 450 kilometers of dozer lines and roads. The next summer, the Carr Fire ignited in Northern California and was about 93,000 hectares and resulted in the installation of 491 kilometers of dozer line and contingency lines. So thinking about the half a kilometer dozer line that we were sampling and the absence of obligate cedar recovery within that dozer line area of half a kilometer, we can kind of imagine what that might mean for almost 1,000 times that, or 100 times that area, or 1,000, excuse me. And thinking about what that might mean for the obligate cedars, as well as the wildlife species that use them for habitat, pollen, and food. So what can we do going forward? One of the things that we can do is map and reuse fire lines whenever possible. Pictured here is a dozer line that was installed for the Helena fire in 2017. This dozer line was actually reused this summer in the Monument Fire in 2021. Cal Fire also reused dozer lines that were originally installed for the Camp Fire in 2018 in the North Complex fires that occurred in 2020. Reusing these dozer lines would not have occurred if these fire agencies didn't know where they were in the first place and if they weren't in strategic locations. So when we know where they are and it happens to be in a strategic location, it can be very beneficial, not only for obligate cedars and the wildlife species that defend or that depend on them, but also the dozer line operators that are coming in and digging these fire lines. When we think about the original installation of these fire lines, looking at this other slope across the road, we can see it's very thick with a chaparral community. When an original dozer line operator came in here, it is not a fast or easy job to be clearing this area, and there's usually a fire burning somewhere nearby when they're digging these dozer lines. So being able to reuse something either 4 or 2 years later will be much safer for that dozer line operator as well, making a lot of a lesser impact on the species and the firefighters, keeping us safe. Another thing we can do is be really intentional with our fuel treatments. So fuel breaks and fire breaks are also linear features on the landscape that sometimes, depending on what methods used, can resemble these dozer lines. So thinking about lessons learned, what we learned from this can really help us when planning our fuel treatments for the future. I'd really like to thank Claire for letting me share her work today, the rest of my field assistants, my advisor, and Dawn Hankins and Colleen Hadfield for all their support. And thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
Excellent presentation, Hannah. So I am not seeing any questions quite yet in the chat, but I have some for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and ask them. So my first question was about the obligate cedars and what the context was post-fire for your area in terms of what was the following year like for precipitation? California has been in the news a lot for drought of late, and I just wanted to know if drought might have a factor into this too.
That's a great question. So the rainy season after this was not the first growing season. There was not too much rain, I believe. I'm not completely sure on that point, but the second growing season, that 2018-2019 season, was very actually high in precipitation. We had a lot of landslides after the Camp Fire, which happened in 2018. So there was actually a lot of precipitation that second growing season. But they might not have gotten as much rain that first growing season. So that could be part of it, because I know that for obligate cedars, that first growing season is really important, but they also need fire. So the fact that they're not coming up in the dozer line isn't all too surprising if, that land isn't getting burned anyway.
Okay, really good point. So Dawn had a question in our presenter chat. Do you think that reusing dozer lines might make the effects more permanent?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely one of the things to think about when reusing these areas, if it might result in type conversion. So I think we should be really cognizant and mindful of when we are reusing dozer lines. It might also cause more erosion issues if we're reusing them. So just being really mindful of, which direction we want to go. If we're not reusing them, but we're digging something close by, it, might have more of effect on a landscape level, but it is really important to think about, do we want this linear feature permanently on the landscape, or can we start, moving away from dozer lines and more doing like covered fuel breaks, which isn't necessarily possible in a chaparral community, but being a little more aware of the effects of them, because it definitely can be permanent. So that was just kind of one solution. But any one of these options, if you're using dozer lines, is going to be really impactful to the landscape. So being really mindful of when we use them.
Thank you. I think if you have a quick answer to this one,
yeah.
Virginia McDaniel asked, were any of the dozer lines reseeded during the rehab work after the fire?
No, there was no reseeding for these dozer lines.
Okay.
So that is something to think about if we wanted to, go in to restore them. Seeding
Right.
would be important.
Well, really valuable study. I hope that you are doing long-term monitoring too. It seems like you're set up for a really nice longer-term view on this.
Yeah, Kristen's lab, thankfully, is working with BLM and working in more Northern California near Redding to continue these studies. So no long-term monitoring on what we were studying specifically, but they have continued this work, which is really exciting.
Really good to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, our next speaker is Mark Kreider. And as Mark gets set up, I will introduce him. So Mark's a PhD student at University of Montana, and he's already published several papers for his master's degree, I believe, on post-fire aspen seedling regeneration. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Aspen's absolutely one of my favorite species, and I will just quickly say, as Mark's setting up, that we've also been noticing really abundant establishment in North Central Washington, where I live. All right, take it away, Mark.
Great, thanks, Susan. And can I just get confirmation that my PowerPoint is being shared properly?
Yes, it looks great.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm excited to share some recent work I've done on post-fire aspen seedling regen. And like Susan said, this was conducted during my master's. I was working with my advisor, Larissa Yoakum at Utah State University. So to start out, I just want to motivate a little bit why we might be interested in aspen as a species. And the first thing is that it's the most widespread tree species in North America. As you can see its range here. It provides tons of ecosystem services across this range, from habitat for animals and species diversity, as well as, at least anecdotally, a fire break or reduced fire severity in many places with higher fuel moisture. There's also concern over its decline in the Western US. And so for this reason, we're really interested in regeneration of aspen. And so lots of my work has been to understand these processes. When most people think of aspen regen, something like this comes to mind, a dense sea of newly sprouted aspen following a disturbance, in this case, a fire. And this is one way in which aspen can regenerate. So existing roots send up a sucker, which is genetically identical to the parent clone. And suckers tend to be the focus of most aspen regeneration research because they're generally widespread after disturbance and they're hard to miss. However, with climate change, this method presents some limitations. For one, since genes are the same as the parent, there's no opportunity for adaptation to changing environments. And there's also limited ability to migrate in response to changing climate, since these suckers must come up by definition, by default from where root systems exist already. However, instead of resprouting from existing roots, aspen can also reproduce sexually through seed. So a given aspen tree can produce over 1 million of these tiny seeds in a given year. And some of these can then germinate and grow into seedlings. In contrast to suckers, which are, of course, clonal and genetically identical to their parent clone, a seedling origin aspen is unique and it contains a mix of genes from both its female and male parent trees. And so this presents some benefits over suckers, especially looking toward the future. The first is that sexual regeneration increases genetic diversity, which creates adaptive capacity to respond to selective pressures like changing climate or pathogens and herbivory. These tiny seeds are also wind dispersed and have been shown to travel distances up to 10 miles, which greatly facilitates aspen's ability to track changing climate across the landscape. I also mentioned some of the concerns over aspen decline, and in certain places, aspen has been lost from the landscape. And so in these places, seedling regeneration represents some of the best way to recolonize these areas, since it can cross distances much quicker than suckers. And in the same way, finally, aspen seedlings may be able to help prevent type conversion in places where conifer regeneration is increasingly reduced or non-existent. And especially because aspen is the most widespread tree in North America, it's This means that it can do well in a range of climates and locations. However, in spite of these advantages, aspen seedling regeneration was considered very, very rare in the Western US until recently, and largely discounted. And this came from the untested assumption that it was simply too hot and dry in the Western US for seeds to germinate and survive. And so we see very absolute statements in the literature of the time, such as this one, that aspen is unable to reproduce by seed in the Front Range of Colorado, or no fact of aspen ecology, in Utah at least, seems more certain than the aspen trees reproduce only through vegetative means. So in this context of assumed rarity, it was enough to publish a paper on the discovery of a single aspen seedling, which did ironically occur in Utah. And even when these seedlings were found in much greater numbers, such as after the 1988 Yellowstone fires, it was generally seen as a rare event and attributed to favorable climate. However, in the following years, we've seen many other occurrences of aspen seedling establishment, and together these have forced us to reconsider some of our previously held notions about aspen seedling regeneration in the Western US. However, information on aspen seedlings still continues to be much more scattered, anecdotal, and localized compared to sucker-based research. And so much of my work in the last couple of years has been to address some of these knowledge gaps. In specific, just the basic question of how common is aspen seedling establishment. And then going further beyond that, we'll talk about some patterns of where seedlings establish across the landscape. So the first question I will be addressing is how common these are following recent fires, and then going further into depth on where they occur. So these blue dots on the map are places that occurrences have been documented over the last 100 years. However, almost all of these occurrences were discovered by chance, and so they aren't necessarily a representative sample. And for the most part, they're also presence only, meaning that we don't know where seedlings were not. So we can't infer how common seedlings are from these data. So to get a question on how common seedlings are, in 2020, the summer of 2020, I led a crew, and we established a search area from the Grand Canyon all the way up to the northern border of Wyoming, and then identified every fire over 50 hectares that burned in 2018 on public land in areas with aspen. And we then traveled to each of these fires and established plots to survey for aspen seedlings. So this was 2 years post-fire. Yeah, and in response to the previous data, these are a systematic presence-absence sort of plots, so we can get a handle on how common they are. So we traveled to 15 fires in this area and established plots in these fires for a total of 329. Each plot, we had a search area of 100 square meters, where we identified all aspen seedlings as well as the density of aspen suckers, and measured a variety of other covariates to explain presence. So in these plots, we needed a way to differentiate seedlings from suckers, since they're the same species, and they become essentially indistinguishable after only a few years of growth. It is possible to dig up a potential seedling and see if it has a connected root system or not, to tell if it's a clone, but of course, then you kill every seedling that you identify. So in these plots, we needed a way to differentiate these. And so we used some methods that we developed the previous summer. And there's many factors that one can use to tell a seedling apart from a sucker, such as the bud scars that are left by cotyledons, as shown in this photo. But the important thing was that we had high levels of accuracy, at least in this 2-year post-fire window, meaning that we could go into the field highly confident of when we found a true aspen seedling. So of these 2018 fires that we surveyed, we found aspen seedlings present in 80% of fires, 12 of 15. And overall, about 12% of plots had at least one aspen seedling. And this was more than any other conifer species other than lodgepole pine. So it's, I mean, 12 isn't a very high number, but it's higher than for example, ponderosa pine or Douglas fir in our plots. And within fires, this percentage varied greatly. Some fires only had 2% of plots occupied, others all the way up to almost 2/3 of plots occupied by aspen seedlings. Densities also varied greatly across this region. In occupied plots, the median density was only 1 seedling per plot. However, in several fires, we did find seedlings in much higher densities, up to nearly 100 seedlings in certain plots. And so in addition to simply how common seedlings are, we are of course also interested in where seedlings establish and why they might establish in certain parts of a fire and not others. So to answer this question, we used a Bayesian framework to model the presence of seedlings across these plots. And the most important variable linked with where seedlings established was the 30-year climate of that site. So as some context, I show here the climate envelope of aspen's western distribution currently. These are the combinations of mean annual temperature and precipitation that aspen occupies. And now here are the climate combinations of the sites that we surveyed for seedling presence, with red dots sites that had aspen seedling establishment. So while seedling establishment is possible in dry sites, such as down here, the vast majority of occupied sites were in wetter areas. And so accordingly, our model predictions show that seedling occupancy probability drastically rises as you go towards wetter sites. As a comparison, this is the probability of sucker occupancy in these same sites. So while it also does decline a little bit in drier sites, the effect is not nearly as pronounced. And it's possible that suckers do better in these more arid locations because they can make use of shared root resources. Other important predictors of occupancy included how many suckers were in a plot, with seedling occupancy decreasing in plots with more suckers. As expected, seedlings were also more likely to establish in plots with increased amount burned, likely because there was a greater amount of suitable microsite for seed germination. These tiny seeds can't germinate through heavy layers of duff and litter, and so they are very dependent on burned soil to generate or to germinate. And finally, we also see a decline in occupancy as the distance to seed source increases. However, notice that this decline is much less sharp than it would be for conifers. Since conifer seed generally, depends on the species, but cannot disperse further than 200 meters or so. And in 9 plots with seedling establishment with aspen seedlings, the closest live aspen was greater than a mile away. I'm showing how far these little seeds can fly. One site in particular, this was in the Coal Hollow fire in central Utah. We were on a ridge here with high severity standard placing fire with the nearest live trees over 1,600 meters away, with deep valleys in between. However, somehow we still found an aspen seedling on top of a ridge nestled next to this log here. So it just goes to show how far this light wind dispersed seed can fly. So I guess summarize our findings here. This was the first study to quantify aspen seedling establishment across a regional scale, and we found seedlings in 80% of fires that we surveyed. So this is in stark contrast to historical assumptions that seedling establishment was exceedingly rare. All 3 of the fires that we did not find seedlings in were very small, with few plots surveyed. So it's possible that we just missed them. However, it's important to note that by and large, the seedlings were pretty low density. Even though they occurred in most fires, they generally did not occur in very high densities, only a single seedling per plot. And the variability between densities is likely due to seed availability and seed pressures, something that we don't know much about. For example, when trees produce seed, what factors contribute to that? It could be that smoke and stress do trigger seeding, but it's an area that is not well understood currently. In terms of spatial patterns, we found seedlings established more more often wetter sites and in areas with fewer aspen suckers. And some additional work that we've done tracking seedling survival over time shows that both survival and growth are also reduced in sites with more suckers. So Aspen is unique that it has both of these regeneration methods compared to most conifer and other dominant tree species in the Western US. And it's quite likely that both methods serve important roles for Aspen. For example, suckers can help to maintain existing clones when that clone is well adapted to current conditions. And then seedlings can help to expand Aspen's current range or just even fill in the gaps between clones. And also, of course, because they increase a genetic diversity, they can help to shift populations through adaptive selection when climate conditions are not quite aligned with the existing genotype. So given all that I've shown, how we found seedlings in most fires, a logical question is, why haven't we seen more? And I think a big reason is that we haven't looked for them very often. I think that because of the dominant view of aspen seedlings being very rare, I would guess that most seedling establishment in the past that has occurred has just been assumed to be sucker regeneration. Part of that is because they're hard to tell apart, and it's only really possible in the first several years before they grow more. One other reason I think is that in an era, with lots of fire suppression, we have less area burned across the landscape, and because seedlings are very dependent on burned areas to regenerate, it's possible that we haven't seen as many because there hasn't been as much fire as there was historically. However, it's important to keep looking for them, and especially in that immediate window post-fire, when they can be determined or distinguished from aspen suckers. So I think it's likely that aspen seedlings have played an important role in Western forests historically, even if we weren't aware of it. However, they might be all the more important in a changing climate. And I think it's also important, to realize that these seedlings can travel very far distances compared to suckers, and so especially if we're concerned about species populations moving across the landscape, seedlings might represent a good way for aspen to do that. And finally, aspen fulfill many of the same ecosystem services as conifer species. And so in areas where conifer establishment is reduced increasingly, aspen may help to pick up a bit of that slack. So for all these reasons, it's important to continue to identify, protect, and research aspen seedlings, and to better understand the role that they play in Western forests at large. Here are a few recent papers that we've published on aspen seedling ecology if you're interested in learning more. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks for watching.
Really great presentation, Mark. Thank you so much. So I'm not seeing questions quite yet in the chat or the Q&A, but
it looks like we have a hand raised and Sean Parks.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. I couldn't figure out the chat. I'm sorry. Mark, great presentation, and I noted that you showed that seedling presence is related to percent of plot burned. I'm wondering if you also looked at severity of the plot at all, and even if you didn't explicitly look at it, did you at least have any do you have any qualitative, I don't know, views of that?
Yeah, we also included severity in our model. It didn't emerge as a significant predictor. I guess likely because many of we didn't have lots of variation. I guess most of the places we were sampling had been pretty high severity sites. I will say from other work in the Bryan Head fire in southern Utah, we sampled across about 70 plots within this area, and we did not once see a seedling establishing on ground that hadn't burned over like 1,000 seedlings that we tagged. And so I think it's pretty clear from my work that these seedlings do need burned soil to establish, but it seems like any fire severity that removes that litter and duff layer seems to be suitable.
Thank you.
I had a follow-up question for you, Mark, and that is, when you were doing your plot surveys, Did you record microsite characteristics where you saw those aspens, such as next to a log?
Yeah, that's a great question. In this study, we didn't. However, in another study, the second citation, or the second citation here on this screen right now, we track seedlings over time. And in that case, we did record microsite, for example, if they were in topographic concavities or next to a log. And we did show that seedlings were more likely to establish in concave microsites as well as next to logs. However, some of that might just be that's where the seed accumulates as it blows across the landscape. And so we are tracking survival to see if that actually confers any benefits over time.
And that's pretty cool. It's a little bit like cottonwood eddying in a river.
Yeah,
you can imagine that the seeds would accumulate. Very neat. So, well, thank you very much. Okay, we are going to move on to our final speaker. So as Don loads his presentation, it's an honor to introduce Don Falk. He's a professor in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at University of Arizona. And he's joined appointments with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research there and the Arizona Institute for Resilience. So here we go, Don. Thank you.
It's showing up okay?
It is.
Great. First of all, happy Palindrome Day, everybody. And if you don't know what that means, after the session is over, go look it up. See if you can predict when the next one would be. I'm really honored to be making this presentation on behalf of my co-authors. These are co-authors on a paper that's currently in review. And I want to give a lot of the credit that I'm going to present to these folks as well as others. I also really want to thank the presenters in this session up to this point. I have the privilege of going last, which usually is kind of problematic, but actually having these beautiful mechanistic studies that every one of our presenters up to this point have shown is illustrating the main point, which is the imperative to develop a deeper mechanistic understanding of forest resilience. I want to begin by acknowledging that the areas where we study resilience are colonized lands of many indigenous peoples who maintained that resilience for many thousands of years and from whom we have a great deal to learn. Here in Tucson, we still live on the landscape with the Tohono O'odham and Yaqui peoples, as well as many other cultures that exist and to this day in the Sierras in Mexico. So I did a quick count. I think there are at least 14 presentations about resilience, implying that we might know what it means. But in my experience, ecological resilience seems to mean something different to a lot of people. And this is not a bad thing. It's just an emerging concept. But in order for us to study it and put it into practice in management, and especially to translate it into land management policy, we've really got to sharpen our understanding of what it means. So we are, I think, collectively moving toward a model of ecological resilience, but I want to make a few points by way of beginning. First of all, resilience is an emergent property. Resilience itself has no units. That's the easiest way to realize that you're thinking about an emergent property and not something that you can actually quantify. So this is one of the reasons why we need to drill down into the mechanisms to understand and predict and manage for it. Secondly, it's really important that we remind ourselves that ecosystems are not stable entities over space and time. All kinds of events, I'm using the word disturbances with apologies to Kevin here, but across scales of space and time, there are many factors that are always destabilizing or de-equilibrating ecosystems. And this will become extremely important when we start talking about a resilience framework. But the important thing is for us to break away from the idea of an undisturbed ecosystem, or in particular, in our case, an unburned ecosystem. I would challenge you to find an unburned forest anywhere in the Western United States. I would say no existe. Some of them may have had longer time since fire, but there are no unburned forests. And in general, we could say there are no undisturbed forests. A good way to illustrate this is just to think about the age structure of forests in Western North America. And with a few notable exceptions that I've listed here, and they are extraordinary precisely because they are exceptions, most forests in the Western North America originated during the Little Ice Age. And that illustrates this aperiodic disturbance turnover in forest stands. The Little Ice Age, in terms of forest age, is really not that long ago. And so it's not to say we're looking at uncharacteristically young forests, even in areas that have not had anthropogenic disturbance directly on site. It's important that we think of forests as always undergoing change and always undergoing turnover. And so the first idea that I'm going to propose here is that it's important that we nest resilience within very important evolutionary and ecological processes of ongoing change. And we see this obviously when we look at the pollen record, changes in species abundance since the last glacial maximum, and then even down to the individual species level in the pollen record. And of course, we're all familiar with these, but we may not always internalize what they mean for us, which is to break away from thinking of ecosystems and particular forests as stable entities. So what we're proposing then is a unified framework of ecological resilience that pulls together a number of different pathways that we are observing into a single connected framework. And I'll be walking through some of the phases of this diagram here during this talk. I'm going to have to be very cursory in the treatment of some of them, but I'm happy to share this with you later. But you'll probably see some familiar space in here: persistence, disturbance, followed by mortality, recovery, the existence of alternative states. Transient reorganization is something we see a lot, and of course Mark's work with Aspen is a great illustration of that. Aspen is kind of the poster child of a transient reorganization. So let's walk through this a little bit, and I'm going to try to save the most time for that last phase of reorganization because I think it's the most interesting and problematic and least understood. So the first phase of resilience, of course, is persistence. That is the ability of the individual to survive through a stressor. It's important to say at the beginning, this reflects life history evolution. These are not random survival processes. These are absolutely the result of biological evolution. Now, we all know that persistence is what provides us the greatest continuity with, say, a pre-disturbance state. And for that reason, it's the state that we're happiest about. It's the focus of a great deal of management effort, such as fuel treatments to reduce fire severity. So that continuity is a foundational management goal. And we understand the mechanisms of persistence in many cases, whether it's thick bark trees, to be able to resist fire, trees that can resist cavitation or embolism, as in contrast to drought. So there's a number of anatomical characters that reflect that evolutionary adaptation to disturbance. And we can see this empirically in our own fire history records, where we see individual trees surviving multiple fires. That is ipso facto evidence that, that there is this deep persistence ability. We should include, though, of course, resprouting as a survival of the genetic individual. I've just shown three different kinds of expressions of that. On the left, silverleaf oak. This is 1 year after a big fire we had here last year, the 2020 Bighorn fire. And you can see that silverleaf oak is on its way to recapturing this site very quickly, the same genetic individual. In the middle, epicormic resprouting in eucalyptus, and on the right, Chihuahua pine, the only resprouting pine in our part of North America, both epicormically and basal resprouting. Now, we then, of course, all know that individuals reach a point where their mechanisms of survival have been overcome. And I wanted to recommend, if you didn't hear them this morning, some great work by Morgan Varner, Kevin Hires, Sharon Hood, and colleagues, just as an example on the mechanisms of crown scorch and recovery and mortality. That's a great example of the level of detail we need to bring these mechanisms. But we can say categorically, as in terms of these emergent processes, that when persistent fails, the next stage will be recovery. And now we're bumped up to the population level. So we're up at a different level of organization. On the right, I'm going to show a series of panels of repeat photography by my colleague, Jim Malusa, who's been been studying areas burned in 1994 and 2011 in the Chiricahua Mountains as that site recovers. So there's a lot of work currently and a lot of work being presented at this meeting on the recovery of severely burned areas where mortality has occurred that depend on seed dispersal and seedling survivorship. And we see these processes in action in front of us all the time. Persistence and recovery taken together represent the more classical framework of ecological restoration. That is to say, once there's a disturbance that has disrupted the original state, then either by natural processes or by management interventions, we try to bring back that previous state. And so I would argue that persistence and recovery are what a lot of people mean by resilience. We're comfortable with it. We're happy about it. I'm happy about it. And whenever we can achieve that, it's great. And of course, these are really important and well-studied processes. But again, in order to understand that larger framework, we need to drill into the mechanisms by which recovery happens. And some of these are well-studied. Some of them are less well-studied. For the example, the existence of a persistent soil seed bank that we heard from Hannah earlier is a great example of an understudied recovery pathway. We also recognize then that recovery has its own limitations when some of those key processes fail. And this is why we need to understand the mechanism in order to understand where they are failing. So an example of this would be seed dispersal following very large fires with large contiguous high severity patches. This is the footprint of the Las Conchas fire, 2011. In the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. And you can see just by inspection the size of some of these large high severity patches, which are far too large for a single generation of tree seedlings to reach in by the information we have, leaving aside the occasional long distance dispersal. I think the literature tends to indicate that most dispersal is within 100 to 150 meters for conifers, and again, leaving aside the longer distance dispersal of aspens that Mark just talked about. So in this situation, under natural conditions, without management intervention, if you do the math, it would take centuries for seeds to reach the interior of these large patches. And once they get there, of course, they've got to find suitable sites. So this is an example of a breakdown in the recovery mechanism. And this is one of the processes then that leads to this third phase of reorganization, sometimes called transition, realignment. And here again, we bump up from another level in biological organization. We started at the individual, recovery is at the level of the population. Reorganization occurs at the community level because it's about species interactions. And these are all examples of post-fire reorganization occupied, interestingly, by different plant functional groups, ferns, grasses, shrubs, and trees, respectively. This means that reorganization now is going to follow a completely different set of rules from those that regulated persistence and those that regulated recovery. And in particular, what's going to be the primary guiding principle here will be community assembly processes, the processes that select among multiple species when there is an ecological opening at a site. But there is so much we don't know about these reorganized systems. First of all, are they transient or are they persistent? This would make a huge difference in how we might think about them ecologically and certainly how we might manage them. Secondly, are they better adapted to future conditions? In the Southwest, we see a lot of areas following high severity fire that are colonized by gamble oak. And there's a lot of suspicion that gamble oak may be persistent on the landscape precisely because it's better adapted than its predecessor. And lastly, we have to ask, and this may be more of a values question than an ecological question, is reorganization an expression of resilience or its failure? I'm not going to try to adjudicate that. We have placed reorganization within the resilience framework because I think in some cases there is good reason to do so. Certainly the heartbreaking loss of beloved old growth stands is not something that we would take lightly. And yet reorganization is clearly something that in life history, as I showed earlier, in the paleoecological record, is an ongoing process up to this very day. So what are the mechanisms that regulate this last phase of ecological reorganization itself? And I'll just go through this again quickly, but just to try to tie this together. So you begin with a pre-disturbance state, and that has a certain climate and disturbance envelope. Let's allow there to be a punctuating event, either a heat wave, for example, shown in the climate envelope, that spike, or a severe fire. So usually there is some kind of triggering event that disrupts the pre-disturbance state. That leads us to that first loss of persistence and mortality. Now, if recovery is successful, then of course you will simply lead back to the pre-disturbance state. But as we've seen, there are many cases, either because of repeated disturbance or an unfavorable climate, where recovery may fail. And this is when we then begin to move quite seamlessly and naturally into the process of community reassembly, a process that has been occurring in ecosystems for a very long time, drawing on the species that are present in the landscape species pool. Now, if those species are native and have been established in the landscape for a long time, we may feel one way about this community reassembly compared to how we might approach it if the species invading are non-natives, such as we're seeing a lot here in desert grasslands. This community reassembly then can move into a persistent alternative state, particularly if what were disturbance events, such as fire, become reinforcing events. And similarly, if the climate was unfavorable to maintenance of the pre-disturbance state, the climate can actually become a reinforcing factor to reinforce that alternate state. And I'll give a couple of examples here. But this is a crucial factor, that the very same processes that may have caused disruption in the pre-disturbance state, particularly climate and disturbance here, become reinforcing events that lock in those alternative states and make them, in fact, resilient in a new configuration. So I mentioned transient reorganization. This is an example that we're all familiar with, and we can nest this then within our framework. Conifers coming up after a fire in 1879. I don't think these have been aged, but you can tell just by their size, they're fairly recent. And with apologies to Mark, I've always assumed that this is mostly a clonal stand. I guess I should go back and look more carefully. But this would be an example of transient reorganization that we're comfortable with, even if this is going to take 100 to 150 years to come back to a conifer stand. As ecologists, we understand this. And so we can extend our comfort zone, if you will, and call this mode of reorganization something that we would address as resilience. But we can eventually get beyond these into what are often called type conversions. And type conversion here, I think, would just be considered the end member of a reorganization process, where the combination of severe disturbance and then these reinforcing factors lead to a complete conversion into a persistent state. Even type conversions, of course, have their own ecology, and they are resilient in that, can be in that new state. Some of them, such as this example from Tony Caprio in Socorro Kings Canyon, seem to be stuck, and they don't seem to represent any alternative state that's recognizable on the landscape. The importance of these reinforcing events can't be enhanced enough. And I'll just give this one example that you'd all be familiar with the change in the fire regime by the introduction of cheatgrass into a grass fire regime. So you could say we have an exotic species, but what we really have is a non-native fire regime. And this is a classic example of this feedback loop that locks in the alternative state. And once it is in that alternative state, it remains highly resilient in that state. One of the reminders that resilience is not always something that we appreciate. So this is just a quick snapshot of a way that we can tie together these variety of trajectories, some of which we're familiar with and consider desirable, some of which we're not so sure about, and some of which we think are really problematic on the landscape, and embrace the fact that a continuum of ecological processes is creating not only the persistence in the existing state, but also these transitions to alternative states, some of which we may be living with for a long time as climate change progresses. I want to again thank many people who have contributed ideas to this. I'll take responsibility for any of the weaknesses in my presentation and give these folks all the credit for their contributions. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thank you so much, Don. It was excellent. We do have time for questions. And in fact, if this group wanted to stay on and just do more of a turn on your screens and have more of a conversation, we have time for it. There's an extra 20-minute slot. So you could either take a nice little break outside or stay on Zoom with us and follow up with some questions for Don.
And actually, can I recommend questions for any of the panelists if they're still on? Because we've got time, and I think they deserve questions too.
Absolutely. Thanks for that clarification. In true form, I will start out a question. And this has to do with thinking through, especially post-fire deciduous recovery. So you showed a nice picture of Aspen with then conifers coming up underneath it, Don. One of the questions that I've been having is we're hearing a lot about type conversions up in the boreal, where black spruce might not recover for a variety of reasons and give way to aspen. It seems to me that sometimes there's this larger landscape context of how that works, rather than just a stand dynamic recovery. It's also in the context of how fire is moving across landscapes. Wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So your question is a reminder that the landscape context and the mosaic of states on the landscape is something we give lip service to all the time, but sometimes we get very anxious about it if it's occurring in a place where we didn't want it or expect it. So I'm not suggesting in any way we should become complacent about those smaller scale type conversions if they appear to be locked into an alternative state. I would have to say that, and I didn't really stress this point, but we reach a point of what's ecologically feasible as well as desirable in terms of our own intentions. For example, here in the Southwest, there are some of the Sky Island mountain ranges where a return to the Little Ice Age flora is probably not in the cards for the foreseeable future. And so for better or for worse, it may be something we have to live with just in terms of the climate envelope and the climate feasibility. And I suspect you could make the same argument in the case where you're describing, that we could say, just as a basic principle, that the ecosystem is responding to the forces that are acting on it. And that includes both its internal and its external forcing mechanisms. And so if that's what we're seeing in the boreal forest, you could say, okay, that's what the forest wants to be right now. And either we need to reverse it for site-specific reasons, or we decide that we're going to live with it, which is hard.
Thank you. It looks like Seth has his video on, and I'm wondering if you wanted to go next.
I had a question because I think that heuristics are really helpful for envisioning.
Seth, you're breaking up a bit. You might want to turn your camera off. I'm sorry.
Or you could type your question into the chat.
Yeah.
Development, and I know that, and you're typed into the chat or the question and answer box.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, why don't you try that? That sounds great.
It's already. Can you see it?
Let's see.
If you can read it, Susan, and then read it out, then everybody could hear it. That would be great. I'm not seeing it yet.
I'm not seeing it yet. If someone sees it, please let me know. So I see that question. Go ahead, Seth. Why don't you try again?
Yeah, my question was, can you compare your resilience heuristic to C.S. Holling's adaptive cycle heuristic, and how is your improvement?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll make a friendly amendment to your question and also say that there's for example, the RAD framework that is being used a lot and adapted into management. I think C.S. Holling's single paper has been cited more than everything I've ever published, like by about a factor of 4. So I would not in public ever say that one could improve on his framework. I'll say this, it does have a kind of cyclicity to it that I think is probably not the way I see the world. There have been versions of Holling that have expanded his model into a third dimension that imply a change. But that's a kind of directional vector of change. And I see these transitions as being much noisier. And but Holling's framework is absolutely foundational. And the RAD framework, likewise, I think we have a lot in common there. The distinction, if I would make one, is only that we have a very poor understanding of the mechanisms that lock in these alternative reorganized states. And in some cases, we also don't understand very well how persistent they're going to be. So I would suggest only that it's that next level down from observing a type conversion, for example, to understanding the mechanisms that got it there and the mechanisms that are maintaining it there, that is where we all are trying to move forward.
Brian.
Thanks for that question.
Great. Brian, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Don. That was a great talk, and I really like the idea, the framework that you present of at least highlighting the fact that we often have a pretty we can get trapped into a pretty narrow lens of thinking about what resilience means, and so I really appreciate it. And a question I had was when you brought up the idea of, I think you mentioned that, in the community reorganization phase, oftentimes that can be seen, at least from our subjective lenses, as a negative, a loss of something that was there pre-fire, but oftentimes that can be a community that is much more adapted to future conditions. And I'm curious in this piece that you're working on, if it made me think about, it almost seems like with directional change or change that seems to be pretty squarely directional in a lot of different dimensions, I'm almost having a hard time thinking about like, are there cases where that's not adaptive, right? Where like it's setting it up for failure in this directional change? And I don't know if you thought about that with like different type cases where that could occur.
Yeah. I'd have to say that is a great question about which we know very little at this point. Your question reminds me to be explicit on one thing, which is there may be carbon consequences for some of these conversions. Most of these alternative communities are less carbon rich on the landscape than their replacements. And if this is happening at a kind of forest patch scale, that may not be a big deal. But needless to say, if that became extensive over a biome scale, that could be a very serious consequence, and it would lead us into a whole different set of questions about intentional management of the landscape for carbon, and basically preventing it from becoming where its trajectory is leading. As for the future fate of these alternative states, there are so many unknowns there that include novel insect populations, novel propensity to drought. I think that to the extent that these communities are already present on the landscape, it may be imperative on us, instead of kind of abhorring them and looking the other direction and saying, I don't want to see that, do kind of what Hannah did with a dozer line and like, go there, right? So I would say that the ecology of these areas probably needs a lot more work, and some of them have been around for quite some time. We have a photograph taken here in the Catalina Mountains just outside of Tucson that was taken 100 years ago of a site that had just type converted due to a patch of high severity fire. Well, more than 100 years ago, 1912. And that's before we think of climate driving type conversion, right? And yet there's the photograph. You go out there today, my friend Jim Maluso took those repeated that one, and it's almost identical. So clearly something was right about that. It's turned into a persistent shrub field. So that one shows no sign of breaking down, but I don't think that we know nearly enough about the ecology of these reorganized sites as legitimate plant communities. So great question, Brian. Thank you very much.
Any other questions for any of the speakers?
I do have a question, if I might come up with another. This is for Kevin Robertson. I'm interested in how you view the role of hurricanes in maintaining longleaf pine savannas. We know that fires are important, but hurricanes come up along every once in a while and they're destructive, but are they necessary for long-term maintenance of longleaf pine savanna?
Well, as it turns out, Kevin is no longer with us, but Scott Hokwinski is. Take it away, Scott. Maybe he's only there in name.
Seth, I'll just impose into your question. It's a great example, being a little bit of a pyro. I don't think about hurricanes as much as I should. And I will go back and revisit that within our heuristic framework, but it seems to me that it is both an opportunity for post-storm regeneration and perhaps refreshment of the age structure and spatial structure of the landscape, since hurricanes are not new, but also opportunities for type conversion. And I guess I would ask you, are you aware of post-hurricane type conversion that seems to be persistent? That would be fascinating to know about if it's been seen.
I am not aware of that per se, but it seems like the potential is there for sure. But I think our mental model of longleaf pine forests is that they persisted over the millennia just with the application of frequent fire, whether anthropogenic or through lightning. But I'm wondering whether, maybe they just get too thick at some point and it takes a good hurricane to knock some down and thin them out to really keep them going. Because basically most or a lot of the southeastern coastal forests are within reach of a hurricane. And yeah, I don't know. But to answer your question, no, I'm not aware of type conversion. In fact, after Hurricane Hugo, the managers talk about this wall of wood that's coming along due to this incredible regeneration of pines.
Sean, did you want to add something?
Although I see Sean turned on his camera. Sean, you go.
Yeah, that's just an interesting comparison, I think, thinking about, I don't know anything about hurricanes except they're, I don't know, it's windy. But the fact that ecosystems can recover from hurricanes, it's a natural reoccurring quote unquote disturbance. And if our forests in the Western US aren't, I don't know. I just think that's just kind of an interesting comparison. It shows, it's just yet another example of our contemporary fires being out of whack or uncharacteristically severe or different, because fires certainly occurred, a bunch long time ago, but the forests did persist. So that's just, I don't know, an interesting comparison.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't really mention this explicitly, but I would suspect that a hurricane leaves a much richer legacy in terms of both the physical legacy and the material legacy. Jill Johnstone's paper on legacies is really important in this context. I want to ask Mark a question, if Mark, if you're willing. You've done such a brilliant job on Aspen. I wonder if you think there's anything else like it that we've kind of taken for granted that maybe has some ability that is underappreciated, or maybe it's one of a kind.
You mean in terms of other species or?
Other species that maybe we've said, oh, it doesn't do that, and that may have regeneration or dispersal capabilities that we've underappreciated.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not sure if I have any specific species, but I do think that, I mean, like, there are times that I'm waiting to be surprised, and in the direction of like the forest will be more resilient than we give them credit for or assume.
Yeah.
Just even the historical like amount of fire, which still dwarfs what we have today.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, maybe is a hopeful thing, or that we're not giving like these systems that are as much credit as they might be due, but
Kind of in a similar vein, one of the things that I've talked a lot about with Paul Hesberg is restoration of meadows, especially cold meadows. That fire sometimes is stem replacing, and there will be a long absence of conifer or other regeneration, and the meadows will actually be coming back. So. All right. Well, any other questions before we close? This has been such a rewarding general session. It feels like it actually was intentionally organized. Yeah, thank you to all the excellent speakers. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to pass it on to our capable producer. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Really fun.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank all of our speakers for sharing your expertise and experience with us today. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress. Up next, we have our poster session starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time that is centered around the Congress theme of Life with Fire, Prescriptions for Resilience. Many poster presenters will be available to chat with live or answer questions on their posters, so be sure to check it out. To access the poster presentations, please click on the Agenda tab and select Posters. We hope you join us for some great networking and discussion opportunities this evening. Beginning at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have a few Fire Circle discussion sessions, our annual AFE members meeting, and open house, and our We've Got a Movie Sign networking session. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the Agenda tab to the left of your screen, click Sessions, and click the main session title to join. Also remember to participate in the Passport contest by visiting and engaging with our virtual exhibitor booths. Simply click Exhibitors in the navigation bar. Attendees with the most stamps will be entered into a drawing to win a free Fire Congress registration for 2023. Thanks again to our speakers, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.